Hello everyone, welcome back. So for this week, we're going to start getting into our unit on Aboriginal justice. So right at the beginning, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the terminology. What are some things and words that we kind of need to know going into this unit? So the first one is Aboriginal, so the descendants of original inhabitants of Turtle Island, which is North America. This is oftentimes an umbrella term used to categorize all people of First Nations, Métis, Inuit ancestry into a single entity. The usage is acceptable if your intention is to categorize all nations into a single entity. And this is really important. So if you say specifically want to talk about the Tsimshian nation, you wouldn't necessarily just use just Aboriginal people. If you're only specifically looking at Tsimshian, you would use the title of that group of people. And another term is First Nations. So this is a new term referring to the ancestors of the original inhabitants who were classified by the term Indian, which is a term that is now not used. I do know that some Aboriginal people might use this term as a reclaimed term, but for our purposes, we will be using obviously First Nations. So this is to replace the term Indian in the Indian Act and those recognized by the Indian Act, which we're going to talk about a little bit more. So obviously when we talk about Aboriginal justice, we also want to talk about things like what does it mean to colonize. So this is the active process of settling an area already basically inhabited by a group of people. It's taking control of it. And then in assimilation, this is where a person or a group's language or culture is given up in favor of another. And that's essentially what happened in North America. When the colonists first came over from Europe, their whole purpose when they decided to settle here was to colonize and to assimilate, to make the First Nations and Aboriginal people like them, so it was easier to basically conquer them. We also have, this is an interesting term, especially on the fact of the territory that we're on. So unceded. So this is people of that area that never legally signed away their land to the crown or government. An example of this is we currently live on the unceded traditional territory of the Tsimshian people. What that means is that there have been no negotiations to do treaties on this land from the government. The government has acknowledged that yes, this is Tsimshian territory, but it's never been legally given up or given to the government like it was in the other treaties. So if you ever hear someone say unceded, that's what it means. So just looking at British Columbia as a whole, there are 31 different distinct First Nations territories within it. So you can see obviously on the star, so number 12, we are the Tsimshian. And this is just to show you how complex British Columbia is. So oftentimes each of these different kind of territories have their own specific cultures and languages and things like that. And it's really important to be aware of that kind of as we go forward, because oftentimes we think of, oh, it's just British Columbia, but I'm like, it's more complex than that. Way before all the colonists got here, there were tons of very distinct cultures that were here, that had distinct languages, that traded, negotiated, went to war with other nations within British Columbia and beyond. And it's really important to acknowledge that. So just a little bit about the history of British Columbia. It's important for us to know, okay, why are we at the place that we're at right now? So some of it is there was some treaties that were signed kind of on Vancouver Island. These were referred to as the Douglas Treaties. There were 14 of them, and it traded about 927 kilometers of land for money, clothing, and blankets. First Nations kept village sites, hunting and fishing rights, but that eventually changed. So these are the Douglas Treaties on Vancouver Island. You can kind of see most of them around where Victoria is, because that was kind of the area that was first kind of settled and colonized by the Europeans. Then we have in 1871, the BC population was 33,000 First Nations, 13,000 Europeans. It's also really important to note that First Nations until 1949 could not vote provincially, and not until 1960 could all First Nations people vote federally. This is a big deal. This is after World War II, just to kind of show that Canada still for quite some time was not quite ready to be this all accepting and inclusive nation. Then there was a piece of legislation called the Indian Act, which was first created in 1876. It basically gave the government control over First Nations lives and Parliament, so the government could change the act without consulting the First Nations whatsoever. It was managed by the Department of Indian Affairs. They managed each local area. It defined who was considered quote-unquote status Indian, and First Nations were basically moved on to reserves. This kind of was a way for the government to basically try to control each group. Yeah, there's still issues with it today. So in the Indian Act, there was a part that said that First Nations would be allowed to vote, get certain jobs, go to university. In order to do all those things, it basically meant that First Nations people had to kind of give up their First Nation status. So each person who was part of the Indian Act would get basically a quote unquote status Indian card. But if you basically enfranchised, meaning you were given the vote, but in order to do that, you had to give up your status. That meant leaving your community, leaving your culture, leaving all of that behind. You couldn't live on the reserve anymore. You were basically removed. The act also changed the structure of government in each community. Village councils were formed like European town councils. Although at the end of it, the Indian agent could change any decisions that were made in each of the communities. The Indian Act still exists today, and it has been amended and changed. It used to have about 100 clauses. Now it has nearly 200. There have been interesting talks of whether to remove the Indian Act and replace it with something that acknowledges kind of all the things that have come to pass. Some people say, no, it's good because some of the things that exist nowadays kind of protect some of the rights of Indigenous people. It's a very interesting sort of topic, and there's tons of articles that discuss it. So in 1884, one of the changes to the Indian Act was the banning of the potlatch. So for those of you who don't know, the potlatch is an important ceremony that has political, economic, social, and spiritual aspects to it. There's tons of reasons to host a potlatch, whether it be someone is given a new name, that there is a new chief, the raising of a crest pole, tons of different reasons. It's also a way to bring families together, to also kind of have celebrations as well. So when the potlatch was banned, all of the customs regarding regalia, singing, and dancing were all completely forbidden. And those beautiful kind of regalias, whether they were masks, blankets, or costumes, they were all taken from the communities. Some of them were sold to collectors. Some of them were put in museums for whatever reason. And there's still a lot of fights for Indigenous communities to get some of their regalia back. Some of it has been destroyed, though. It's really unfortunate. Now, obviously, throughout all of this, there was resistance. Indigenous people didn't just complicitly just take all of this stuff that was happening to them. And there was a couple kind of interesting protests, particularly we're going to be looking kind of at the ones in British Columbia. One of them was the Stolo Nation of New Westminster protested when the reserve went from about almost 4,000 hectares to 60. So they fought for that. They presented petitions to the officials, but unfortunately nothing was changed. Both the Nisga'a and the Tsimshian fought for recognition of the titles to their land. In 1881, Chief Mountain of the Nisga'a went to Victoria, and in 1885, 3 Tsimshian chiefs met with the Premier at the time, Premier Smith. And he didn't take that too kindly. He basically told them that there was no such thing as treaties in Canada, when we know for a fact that there's a bunch of treaties in Canada. It was kind of his way. He was hoping that they would just go away quietly. There was also the Tsimshian-Nisga'a coalition that continued to make cases for a treaty over reserves. The government officials were invited to the areas to talk. They set kind of the Royal Commission in motion, but unfortunately nothing at that point was really done to settle the land claims or question of Aboriginal titles. But it just goes to show that the kind of Indigenous people, like all across Canada, they weren't going to take this lightly. Like they weren't just going to let all of this happen to them. And then, kind of one of the major sort of last things that the government sort of did to really kind of quell First Nations people was the residential schools. So the residential schools existed from 1831. The last one closed in 1996. I was 5 years old when the last residential school closed, just to kind of show you the legacy of how long it was. Basically, this was essentially a way for the government to sort of spread kind of the First Nations people out very, very thinly to take away their culture, take away their language. And if they could do that to the children, it would create generations which didn't know their language, didn't know their culture. And we can still see the lasting effects of that today. Obviously, there were many struggles in this. Students were forcibly removed. We're talking as young as 6 years old. These schools were run by the churches. There was poor quality to education. They weren't permitted to speak their language. Many of them suffered physical, mental, sexual abuse, emotional abuse. There was a lot going on. A beautiful movie that really kind of shows that kind of in a more Hollywood kind of way is the movie Indian Horse. It's a movie about a young boy. His name is Saul, and he is forced to one of these residential schools, and how he kind of deals with the trauma. He plays hockey. And he's really, really good at it. It's a beautiful movie. If you get the opportunity to see it, I highly recommend it. So why is this important? Why do we need to know all this history? Well, the fact that we are still dealing with these issues. There's still a major legacy of colonization. There's tons of issues that still need to be sorted out. The fact that for some of you from last trimester when we talked about the moose hide campaign, there is still a disproportionate amount of especially Indigenous women, who are very much at risk for abuse and assault, sometimes by their domestic partners, and other times just like society as a whole. We still have a lot of stuff to unpack, and it's important to understand the legacy, to understand why maybe some of the things that are happening today are happening. So we've got some articles that I want you guys to read and kind of go through just to get a bit of a sense of some of the information out there, because the more kind of aware you are of the situation, the better understanding you have as to why things are happening as they're happening today. So I hope you guys take care, look after yourselves, and hopefully I'll see some of you this week.